Well, a short introduction. Today, the agenda of this panel session is going to split in two parts because we're going to look into two issues. Those are the requirements to capital adequacy assessment, as well as the oversight and stress testing, this the other dimension.
So the two subject matters, they are related to preventive oversight, supervision, because unlike the first component of the Basel package, when the banks were supposed to meet the requirements, compliance with the adequacy of the capital, it is the adequacy of the assets, and then Basel II concept is quite old, and it was developed in, I think, 2004 or 2005, and it was enforced later. And unlike the requirements for the norms, this package covers the procedures. The structure of the panel is dualistic because we do not have anybody but the representatives of the two communities. It is the banks and the regulators. Let me introduce the panelists. We have three representatives of regulators. Mr. Michael Kavrigin. He's director of the important bank supervision department, and you know Mr. Alexey Labanov. He's the banking regulation department, and me. Then three representatives of the banks. It is Mr. Vidyakin from Sberbank, Chief Risk Office. Then Mr. Maxim Kondratenko from VTB, responsible for risks, and David Brown, Chief Risk Officer, Alpha Bank. And I think it was the second panel, Mr. Aksakov has defined the Adam and Eve of the banking community. And I think when the banking system was born, and it is the Confucius or neo-Confucius concept that is related to it. There was a prime fabric of the Bank of the Soviet Union, and it was Yin and Yang, who is the female and who is the male, base, black and white. But I think that's what it is, rather than the Christian concept of begetting a man. Because historically, we are the two parts of the historical entity, and we are supposed to seek for harmony. And that's what we will be trying to do here. And the first topic, it is the procedures of the adequacy capital adequacy assessment procedures, and the regulator assesses not the compliance with the standards, but the procedures, internal procedures of the bank for their compliance with the regulator requirements. And some countries describe those requirements in less detail or in more details. And the traditional Russian one, we have written the guidelines first for the requirements of the internal assessment procedures, and then we realized it. And last year, at the end of the year, the largest Russian bank has been exposed to the verification. The central bank checked whether the banks comply to those procedures. And the risk management is another notion. And without talking what this is needed for, let me give you a simple example. If you're not professionally involved in that, the bank could comply with all the standards, but because the reporting and accounting is not accurate, not reliable, concealing the investment objects, rigging the reporting. In the worst scenario, it is withdrawing the assets. Despite all the standards are met, the regulator should come and check to see the other signs of poor management. The regulator might come and see that there were 3 lending committees, and all of them were done by correspondent. And the dossier, the credit dossier reads that there was a phone call from the owner to provide a loan. And so it means that despite all the standards are met, something is wrong, because the internal procedures do not meet the requirements procedures. I simplified, but well, that's how it is. It is in the gist. The issues that the regulators discussed are as follows. There are different approaches applied in different countries to assess the internal procedures, to assess the capital adequacy. And there are no harmonized, unified approaches that exist in the first pillar of the Basel Agreement. And the regulators of each country give answer to the following questions, and the answer is specific to each country, and I will be interesting to know your opinion about it. First, the question is the punishment, the penalty for failure to comply with the procedures. There's no standard, so if the regulator believes that the internal procedures do not meet the requirements, and in this case, the bank is assigned the individual value of the capital adequacy. It's an individual supervision act, but it has its purpose, and it might be 1, 2, or 3% of the capital adequacy on top of the standard value. And if it's not enough, then there is an increment of 2%. It will be 8, 10, 12, 14. But if it is not enough, then to what value this particular supplement should be added? Is it to the latest indicator of the capital adequacy at the latest date, or to the average value for the capital adequacy value in the country? And then to what part of the equity to what part of the capital this percentage points should be added. So, and there are a number of questions raised, and since there is no unified practice in the banking community, each country is on its own, is left to its own devices to decide. And so the issues of unification of the application of the enforcement of the second pillar are just now on the agenda. It is ICAP 2.0. And, well, it was a long introduction, but I just wanted us to come to a common denominator regarding the issue we are discussing. So 2017, the largest banks have been exposed to the procedure of capital adequacy evaluation and risk management evaluation. We have received the results. We have withheld it. We decided not to make it public. I would like to request Mr. Kavrigin, who was responsible for this work, and to share his opinion of this exercise, what conclusion could be made about this kind of exercise. So it's a pleasure to see that much interest is being displayed. We have medical analogies at the IFC, and if we take the procedure, we can compare it with the situation like if there's a medical checkup and the doctor is assessing, evaluating the draft and trying to see whether the person is fit to be a soldier and not. But over here, this particular exercise in the bank, it is a more deeper medical checkup with all the result of the blood and pressure analysis, etc. Talking about the content of this evaluation procedure, it was a combination of consultative oversight and assumptions or judgment, because it was not in any other area of supervision and oversight that we had a discussion when, in the course of the discussion, our colleagues in different formats, it is answering the questionnaires and filling in the questionnaires, described how the bank was working. And the difficulty was that the banks are different, quite different from one another. They have set procedures that have been establishing for a few years, and the regulator has set a benchmark for measuring the banks. And we can say that all the banks, and there were 10 banks that were doing the self-assessment, and all the banks assessed themselves as alpha students. They have assigned 1 point to themselves, being number one. And those colleagues that have given excellent marks to one another, in our opinion, it was over-optimistic, and their particular self-assessment did not stand. And some of them were just was turned over into the consolidation foundation. Correct. And the other day we were trying to pursue the bankers and seeking the information from them, but in this case, the banks have made a presentation about themselves. It is just a tip to those that will be exposed to the evaluation now. The point is not only to send the paper report, but much depends on being able to explain everything about the reporting.
And that was highly useful. So once we developed an insight into this information, with discussions to follow, banks anticipated some feedback, whether everything is clear, whether everything is okay. It was a pilot project. So it is only after the first 3 months that we were able to finalize our estimates so as to compare across identical downsides. And I should admit that this year, this pilot estimate project was largely tailored to developing an insight into whether there are some changes or those are none. Well, in fact, we had to understand whether the information on paper is in conformity with what's going on in practice. And indeed, there were lots of debates and discussions with voting to follow and ultimately decision-making. That was very important for us to understand that all the procedures are diligently followed. And this is a very useful tool to undergo this procedure. Now, I would like to give the floor to my colleagues as to look at this process from the other bank of the river. And we are going to focus on the fallout of the assessment and to whether specific types of capital are oriented to specific risks. So these are two things apart, actually. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Well, to wrap up our talks on the procedure itself, I should say that we decided to disembark from individual measures just because there is huge discrepancy across the globe. All banks that demonstrated failing results according to our assessment procedure were then consolidated. So there was no sense to add up to 3% of insufficient capital. Well, I believe that 2 or 3% with capital insufficiency would not save the bank from a failure, provided that the risk management procedures are malpracticed. So we have to ensure that the impact measures would sensitize the bank stakeholders and the top management to be more careful about the internal procedures. As for other banks, those were subject to specific actions, and we urge these banks to comply with the requirements of the regulator by a certain deadline. So it is indeed a very practical tool. So now I would like to find out what are the lessons learned on behalf of the banks? What are their recommendations? Therefore, I'm going to ask individually questions so as to identify the focus. Well, as for Sberbank, I would like to find out that, ICAP is different from the first pillar of Basel requirements in the way that it assumes that it is the bank that has to identify extra risks that are not included into the first pillar and to duly consider those in capital adequacy assessment. Well, for example, the step-in risk, which is a non-trivial risk. It is something similar to credit risk, but it's specific. And Russia demonstrates these risks. This risk means that the bank is very much into the loan giver and just cannot deliver on the contract terms. So other than launching the bankruptcy procedure, restructuring, and obtaining extra loans, so on and so forth. So the step-in risk is not in the first pillar of Basel agreement. For example, you have 10 or 20% of the capital that has been issued to a specific loaner or loan holder, and there is no other value. So the step-in risk has to be considered by the bank, and it is the responsibility of the bank to calculate relevant losses. And the same stands true to shares or some other market tools. For example, a company that is unprofitable for the last 2 years cannot sell its shares at 180 million rubles. Well, although on the surface it seems to be okay. So these are the rules. The fair price and the market price is sometimes unclear. So if I ask the bank why this bond is there, the bank would reply that they're going to sell it tomorrow, so why should they include this bond into their risks? So the financial ecosystem, both inside and outside banks, as well as IT, that's a good thing, but this also implies risks that are yet unclear. So the risk management in the ICAP and digitalization of the business model risks. This is what I'm getting at. It is a burning question and a challenging one as well. Yes, indeed, this is something that we discussed with the regulator. Well, as for the ICAP, I would like to extend my gratitude to the regulator because this is a great drill which includes 1,153 questions and lots of papers on the guidelines and recommendations. Well, so we do not need risk management because the ICAP guidelines cover for the risk management procedures. So providing over 200 pages of recommendations. And to fill those in would take up roughly 60 working days. My specific gratitude is for the specific solutions, the CLICO solutions, so as to change the format from Excel to CLICO. And that also added up to our job. Well, ultimately, that went fine, so thank you. We did well with our reports for 2016. And yesterday, I finally received the ultimate report, the ultimate assessment of the regulator for 2016. And we are now are getting prepared for 2017. The ecosystem is another extensive issue. The tools that are in ICAP are beneficial, well, as it seems to me. I believe that the ecosystem embraces 3 key risks. The first risk is related to technologies. The second is conduct risk. Regrettably, Russia is not focused on this risk to a large extent. But however, this is something we are discussing with our colleagues from VTB Bank. And the last risk is the balance sheet security. So this scope provides for the three key risk management issues. As for cybersecurity, we included it into ICAP. As for conduct risk and technology-based risk, those are yet to be embraced into the framework in this year. As for risk management, relevant reports are there, and due procedures are there on how to monitor startups, what guidelines to issue for startups. So far, there are lots of open questions on behalf of businesses and risk management, but however, we have common ground to proceed from. Well, shall I take the question about step-in risks? Well, if you wish to. Well, this is related to risk concentration. I hope, I mean, what you mean is your clients, so I know what you're getting at. So higher risk concentration is a relevant issue. We had to deal with a relevant case. So this is something which is taken into account within the ICAP framework. And this is something that may generate some negative spillovers. Well, I would like now to address my question to Maxim Kondratenko, VTB Bank, and to urge Maxim to share his perception, his sentiment. The VTB Bank is the holder of one of the largest Russian banks, VTB Capital, which is well known globally. So VTB is a follow-up to Sovzegran Bank. One of few of those are left, one in France, the other in Austria. Now the VTB Bank is undergoing the SREP procedure, both abroad and domestically. Therefore, I would like to ask, what's the difference between the requirements, the international requirements and domestic requirements? So how are you doing in general amid this scenario? Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to discuss these issues with you. So the topic is clear. Well, us as risk managers have been dealing with this for the last 2 years. It is a highly fascinating dimension for us. It's important to draw difference between the SREP and ICAP. Well, let's focus on ICAP first. ICAP is beneficial for risk management, successful risk management, business responsible risk management is tailored to best practices and best lessons learned. Successful practices are usually included into the overall banking operations. So this is how we used to deal with risk management before the regulator guidelines were issued. I mean the guidelines 3883 and others. Well, risk management is a good thing. Once the regulator is sensitized to this aspect, the reputation of the bank top management is enhanced. So, and this is clearly traced if we look at the operations of all the banks with the public participation and private banks as well.
That's a good result as well. Absolutely. It's not an irony or anything. All the industry is supportive of it. Even more than that, many banks that have been participating in the verification, in the checkup, they have provided the certain indicators. They have established their risk appetite. They have decoded for business lines, and they have inbuilt the indicators into the business management structure. These are the best practices. Then it is time for the regulator to check what was built, and then that's here we have certain subtleties. Our bank was a pilot bank. In reality, it meant that we were the first who were checked by the regulator, both as a solo bank and in the first group of banks. And the first proposal for the future, the thousands of pages will have to be filled in, and I think checking the banks that are the head officers should be unified. Like 90% of all the questions repeat themselves, and the answers are just the same, only they fall into different chapters, and the wording out of the questions is different. Then talking about the format of the checkup. The questions and the amount of the questions aims to achieve a certain goal. And in fact, the foreign practice shows it. So the most of the questions should be addressed to small banks, not large, not majors, because it is very difficult to understand complicated business even after you read thousands and thousands of lines of statistics. What helps the regulator? It is the way the risk management is organized and the risk management reports. So we provide information to both the management and the stewardship committee, the reports on risks, the different areas, the desks that the risks, that monitoring the risks, and then the capital indicators, and we have the traffic lights regarding the risks, and the other things. Those indicators are available for the regulators at short notice if they request it, and we have representatives of the supervision unit. They participate in the meetings of the management of the board and at the lending committee meetings, and they are the people that can provide the feedback to the supervisors and to maintain a dialogue between the bank and the regulators. And another proposals, we should think twice about the advisability of this big table to fill in. If the reports are no good and they should be shortened or modified, the bank might do that, and the banks are interested in providing the information in a uniform manner to both the stockholders of the bank and the regulators. Talking about the practical issues, and Anatoly noted that he was absolutely right that we are operating in Europe. Initially, it was France, Austria, and Germany. Now, our bank has unified some branches, and we have the headquarters in Germany with the subsidiary in Vienna, and we have experience of dealing with the British and Austrian regulators, and we have the experience of dealing with prudential regulation authorities of the UK, PRA, and talking about Germany, we are not a major bank, and there's less attention. If there is a high attention, it's for the very reason that we are a Russian bank, not because we are a major bank. And the same situation is in the UK. However, the approaches of the regulator towards us are different. In the continental Europe is similar to what was offered to us in Russian. In many respects, it's a formal approach, but we have a certain degree of comfort because over there our bank is small and it is easy to describe all the process. And as far as PRA of the UK is concerned, it is a deep dialogue that exists here. It doesn't mean that it is easier to report to the regulator. Sometimes the dialogue is very stringent, and the issues might be very complicated, and in the course of the dialogue, the bank might change its approaching regarding the risk management, and it is beneficial for both the bank and it finds understanding of the regulator, RPA in this case. That's about it, in short. Okay, interesting proposals, and let me put them down, and I think we will collect all of the proposals made over here, and so I have heard that the process is complicated and it is necessary to optimize it, but on the other hand, the banks regard this process as a useful, beneficial procedure for them. They needed to build the risk management system, and the bank realized that their capital should be adequate, taking into account the risk profile. Talking about the Western practices, we are in favor of the dialogue, but if the bank does not agree to something, and if it's not the failure to comply, and what are the results of this CRAP? Have they given you any feedback? Yes, we have received some, but the process lasts for 10 years, and this dialogue occurs not within a calendar year. Banks had an opportunity to get ready for it, for the evaluation, and when I'm talking about the dialogue, I mean it is necessary to meet the expectation of what will be checked and for it to be efficient. There is an experience, and it is part of the PRA procedures. If there are any recommendations that the regulator makes for the bank, and take our example when we had a dispute and when we didn't come to a common understanding, it is the regulator who is right, and the regulator gives certain recommendations that makes it possible to optimize the process. And then, after the work is completed, the checkup is resumed, and okay, we'll make use of that kind of statement if there is a dispute, and if there is a disparity, the regulator in this case is always right. Joking, of course. And I would like to give floor to Mr. David Brown. I would like to warn you that David will be speaking English, so if you do not have your headsets, please get hold of them. And the question is as follows. So, we have heard that the state public banks either the state is the stakeholder, then either the central bank is in this case the supervisor, or the government, and if the capital should be increased, and then the central bank might say yes, please increase make the capital adequate, but let us have less dividends then. But with David, the problem is different. His shareholders are private entities, private persons. And then how does this process take place in a private bank? There are minimum requirements. The bank complies, the bank is happy, and then you have calculated the thing, and then you tell, look, we need a bigger capital, bigger than the central bank requires. What will the shareholder tell you? Thanks for the question, and I think it will be more understandable if I will speak in English, because we have good interpreters.
But let me answer it by a slightly longer path. Quite a few people here today have talked about birth and also quite a few about death. I want to talk at the moment only about birth. Why? Because actually I was more or less present at the birth of this thing that we call PODC in Russia and ICAP in the UK, because at that time I worked as a regulator for then the Financial Services Authority that was then replaced by the PRA. And it wasn't an easy birth. ICAP, PODC, as Maxime rightly said, is something that actually is very useful for banks, very useful for risk management, but very useful on the whole for banks. Why? Because it's a framework that sets out, mostly in terms of principles, how one should build a risk governance and risk management framework and a feedback loop within a bank, so that that risk management process is part of the management process of the bank, part of the process of setting the strategy of the bank, part of the process of measuring the effectiveness of the strategy, and part of the process of the bank challenging itself as to whether it believes it has enough capital to support the activities that it's doing, in addition to thinking not only about today, but also about looking forward, and looking forward in dimensions where the world might not look as comfortable as it looks today. As a risk management proposition, it's pretty close to ideal. So, never mind Mikhail Muratovic's answer to the question when I go to him and say, do you want to put up another $1 billion of capital? He and any other shareholder of any bank, most of whom have no clue that ICAP even exists or what it is, should be very grateful that it's there, because it helps us all to understand better how to manage risk. A lot of what I wanted to say, Max has already said in Russian, so maybe I'll talk a little bit less than I might have intended to. There is, to borrow Max's words and knowing the old Russian joke about this, there is a nuance, because I talked about ICAP as a framework, and I didn't say anything about regulator, right? And the presence of the regulator, in conjunction with that ICAP framework, can make it work well or make it work badly. And I think if you look in the world today, there are examples of both. So I would echo the comments of my colleagues when they say in other words that, look, nobody can possibly understand the answer to a question, is the risk management, is the risk governance framework in a complex and large bank built properly by studying the answers to 700, 800, 1,153 questions. You need to go there. You need to be there. You need to challenge people. It's great, as Mikhail says, that the central bank has observers on the ground. You already come to this process knowing something about whether what we described in all of our sheets of paper really exists. Actually, the FSA, the PRA, I think most regulators don't have that benefit. If this becomes a formal process, if it becomes a process where the only way that the result of an ICAP assessment is communicated to the bank is through 1, 2, 3, 2, 4, 6, 10, 20, 30 points on capital, I think that's, in my own personal opinion, I think that removes some of the value from the framework. From my perspective, the taking of additional capital, it's not about penalising the bank, it's about trying to ensure that the system is adequately protected from the inadequacies of the bank that you've assessed. So if I think about how we in the FSA, how today I believe the PRA would use the framework, they will tailor the additional capital that they take according to the nature and the size of the inadequacies that they find. So for example, at the time I worked at the FSA, for sure we expected people to talk about concentration risk. But at that moment, I don't think any regulator, certainly not the FSA, had a clear understanding of how would they measure whether the addition that a bank saw that it should hold in its capital against concentration risk was viable or not. Over the years that followed, with the help of a number of regulators, regulatory colleagues from the US in particular, regulators develop their own concentration risk models, and therefore they compare their own calibration of concentration risk addition from the bank with their own view of that, what that should look like according to their models. So what am I really saying? What I'm really saying, I think, is that we all need to give ourselves time here to implement this process in a way that creates the greatest value both for regulators and for banks. And we'll do that best by having this dialogue, not just at the International Financial Congress in St. Petersburg, but on a more or less continuous basis. And so that we can understand better not just what you think are the inadequacies with us, but what you see as the inadequacies of the process. And we can answer you with what we see as being the inadequacies of the process. And from that, this will become something that is much more deeply embedded in the process of managing banks and regulating banks. And at that moment, I actually honestly do believe that I could go to Mikhail Muratovic and say to him, look, this ICAP process that we've been participating in, that we've been running, that we come and explain the outcome of it to you on a very regular basis, shows us that we need to have more capital. Because then it's not just you coming and saying, here's 3%. It's us ourselves saying, from our framework, from our understanding of the expectations of the central bank, this is what it's telling us. So we know in advance. It's not just I've got bad news. I just want to tell, I'm probably not even allowed to tell this story, but it's a true story. In 2007, when I was at the FSA was very happy with ICAP because actually the FSA and the Bank of England before them had always operated a flexible capital requirement scheme. It had a different name in the Bank of England days, but banks were individually told, look, this might be the standard, but we want from you this, okay? So the FSA were very happy. They fully intended to use it. The expectation was that the initial rounds of ICAP wouldn't tell us that we needed to have different individual levels of capital from different banks, but yeah, maybe it would. And I remember being on a conference call with BaFin. Max, this is for you. Because the most surprising thing that we heard from BaFin on that conference call was, yes, we understand Pillar 2 exists. Yes, we understand that we need to implement the process, but we will never take a euro of additional capital under Pillar 2. That was a quote from BaFin. I suspect they forgot it a while ago.
Спасибо, Дэвид, за очень интересный и откровенный.
Thank you so much for being so frank. Well, we always stand for dialogue. So, amid this regulatory ICAP reforms, as well as SREP reforms, that we will follow until the end of this year after the first test drills, we will do our best to deliver on your suggestions. I mean, the suggestions that have been put forward by Mr. David, Mr. Brown, and Mr. Labanov. So today we are having just a working session that gives us an opportunity to ask questions and to be frank. I believe that we will successfully find a balance within the ICAP framework between dialogue and supervisory practices. So now I will delegate this issue to Alexei Labanov. While we were discussing ICAP and SREP, I believe that Alexei had enough time to get well prepared for his contribution, so as to sensitize us to both his personal perspective as well as to provide us with the general outlook on how to reduce formalities to a minimum and how to implement supervisory practices most successfully. Dear colleagues, good afternoon. The previous speakers already said a lot about this relevant issue. Before I proceed to ICAP and SREP, I would like to enjoy and to take advantage of this highly professional audience that we're having today here, so as to explain why life is so complicated, why are banks presented with such daunting difficulties. Quite often we lack empathy, which means we are unable to imagine ourselves in someone else's boots, so as to find a solution to the challenge that our partners are presented with. I urge all of you to, for a second, think you are in the regulator's boots, to have the regulators back on you, so that, imagine you have to deliver on the risk management system, you have to deliver on all these challenges that regulators are presented with. Thank you very much for having this comparison with a talk to a patient. Those are like doctors presented with a patient, and provided symptoms are unclear, the doctors will have to perform an array of imaging and lab tests before they would prescribe medication. Well, remote assessment of all banks is roughly similar to the lab and imaging tests that patients have to undergo. Otherwise, the regulator will not be able to understand what's going on. Today we are operating complicated terminology, complicated concepts. And quite often the dialogue does not result into some mutual ground. So we delegated the bank the ability to do self-assessment, which means that ICAP means internal assessment. This means that it is the bank that has to identify its risks, as if the regulator is not there. And the bank has its right to argue the regulator's assessments. So this is a two-stage process. I believe that larger banks would be averse to having some outsiders who would deliver verdicts, telling the banks what is right and what is not, and where they have to do some adjustments, because there's no way for dialogue amid such a scenario. It is crucial to find your way for this to start this complicated dialogue with the bank. I share the view of my colleagues. Larger banks should perform this assessment in communication with the regulator. Otherwise, there is no chance to find your way through the thorny practices. Quite often, even insiders may not have the entire vision of what's going on. So this is an inevitable future for larger banks. As for for other banks, those may not be challenged in this respect. We also have banks with so-called baseline certification that will be freed from ICAP in favor of a simpler procedure. Although an imperative procedure, this does not imply such a close dialogue. The future of ICAP is about larger banks and larger business models. And it's not going to be an easy dialogue. Us as bankers cannot decide whether a specific business model is right, is correct, or inaccurate. It is up to the bank to deliver on this question. However, it is us who can understand whether this is a failing business model that is bound to result in losses. So this is what's called the second type mistake in statistics. And I hope we will be able to identify these mistakes in the budding. So we have to be fully sensitized to what's going on. We decided to do a consolidated assessment within a short term, 2 years. It's a highly challenging task for both us and the banks. Therefore, sometimes we just echo each other's actions. So we will do our best to optimize the procedure so as to give way to the banks that will provide us with early results of their assessments, whereas the rest will be started later, so that we could proceed from the assessment results that will have been obtained by the end of the first cycle, and to translate those into the second cycle. All our requirements within the ICAP is the minimum. This is the minimum that any respected bank has to follow. larger banks have to do more. However, it is very difficult to formalize the procedures without any dialogue. As for punishment for failing banks, for undue banks, well, today, the capital adequacy punishment measures are for the sake of discipline. It's not about to compare banks across one another. This is just to urge banks to eliminate failures within the shortest time possible in a very reasonable way.
It should be an incentive for a bank to change, and the bank should understand what's wrong. And it is not always that the bank could rectify this situation. Like take the mortgage bank that issue loans and they operate with short deposits. This model could be quite profitable. It could be stable, but it is associated with the interest rates. How that kind of risk could be eliminated? No way, because that's the specificity of the business. The only way to get reassured is to increase the capital to cover the risk, to capitalize this particular risk. And so in this case, the capital should be increased if the bank did not take this risk into account. And me personally, I am the proponent and the champion of the subjective idealism. If we talk about the philosophical language in the risk management, it is difficult to say that the risk evaluation should be the same for both from both sides of the business, and that's what the business is about. There are different entities that evaluate risk differently, and then there'll be no chance to either sell or buy something hoping for either a better or the worse. And the situation is such abroad that many supervisors would try to give their own assessment in lieu of the bank. It is supervisory stress testing, and it is moving to another subject and talking about ICAP. And I would like to note when Martin Luther King was moving to Washington, he has pronounced this his famous speech, "I have a dream," and in Russian, the word dream means both dreaming about something and also having a sleep. And it just occurred to me, it's an Theodor Röttger poet last century. He wrote a few lines, and I would like to illustrate our road, our journey. And I woke up and I've been dreaming, and my destiny is where there's no fear. And this, as a matter of fact, this poem is sad because the ultimate goal is clear. For us, the goal is to elevate at least one notch higher the Russian banks, and if we will achieve to do that, that will be great. We will make our contribution into the financial stability by supporting the stability of individual banks. And now, if Alexei will allow me to start to switch over to stress testing, I would like to make a conclusion on the first part. But after your lyrical conclusion, I could see even the tears shining in the eyes of some of the girls present over here. We should leave it unchanged, because we are not talking about the risks or supervisions requirement. We are talking about the culture of the banking community. And so Moving on to next issue of our discussion, it is stress testing. Trying to save time, I will do without introduction. 25 minutes are left. Suffices it is to say what I'm concerned with the stress testing, supervisory stress testing, from the point of view of the concept itself. It is the using of the stress tests in supervision boils down to finding the opportunity to find supervisory measures that bank do not violate anything. It complies with Pillar 1. All these standards, all the internal procedures are construed well, and still, in some unfavorable scenario, if oil, say, $20 per barrel, the bank will lose the capital, and the capital will not be sufficient. And so that's why I have some misgivings, and I might tell you have to be ready somehow, but require more capital, or to require some actions to be done by the bank, it will be wrong. And I've been discussing with the banks, and the banks are saying we use stress testing. Not quite clear how they do that. Maybe it's just in the format of a dialogue. And another item that is associated with the first one, some of the regulators have found the way to apply the results of the stress testing to act upon the bank and bankers, and that is making the results of the stress test public. After the stress test is over, the central bank discloses that the bank such and such, in case it's a stress scenario, the capital will not be adequate. And it's not a penalty, but it's just a measure of against the banks. So I would like to request Alexei to continue. Lyrically, why not? It will be just what is required tonight. And will you make an introduction into the supervisory stress testing? It is not macro stress testing when we say that the banking system will be missing or at a short of 1 trillion rubles, but supervisory stress testing. As a matter of fact, the situation is not that bad. There are quite many tests, and this word, stress testing, has been in use for quite some time. First, it was using it analytically. Now it's with respect to the standard, and it's part of my work. And that is what the bank should do on its own, being ready for the worst. And they are supposed to test them for whether they are strong or not. It is Pillar 2 of the Basel II, and there are standards and norms. They are quite transparent, but maybe not with the required degree of details to do the stress testing. We say, for example, sorry, Alexei, if that's the only possibility to inscribe the supervisory stress testing into the supervision, that we have found it possible to include it into the internal processes, internal procedures. Yes, in compliance with the applicable law, but we expect that the major banks will do more. We at least expect linear sensitivity analysis from small banks as a response to one risk. And normally we say it is credit, interest, and concentration, and do that kind of analysis. And as far as large banks are concerned, then they should respond to scenarios which should be knocked up of different components, and should be complemented with the sensitivity analysis if the plausible or feasible, possible, or less probable scenario. So there are requirements to implement stress tests. Indeed, one should foresee or analyze the events that might take place without playing the game of who might give the biggest losses that might be equal to the cost of the bank. Actually, the most important is the work that is preceding the figures. It is development of the scenarios at the level of the executive of the banks, and then assuming that those scenarios might occur, however, with unknown probability, and it should be documented in the bank documentation so that the supervisors could get themselves acquainted to it, and the periodicity of these scenarios should be listed as well, what measures are taken, and whether those scenarios are taken into account, and what will be the results of the losses, with the exception, say, of the psychological misgivings. That's that we're expecting that every bank should do. However, the practice shows that this bank is useful not only for individual banks, and I would like to thank my colleagues from the bank supervision and Mikhail Bezludny for the slides that I borrowed from bank. So the banks have been doing the stress testing for the analytical purposes, including the sensitivity analysis and the scenario analysis, to include a number of the macroeconomic transient underpinned by the macroeconomical models and shocks. It is the factors that will change the market, the risk, the market and the other risks, and that kind of stress testing is done regularly by the supervisors. Like sensitivity analysis should be done monthly. The scenario analysis should be done once, 4 times per year. It might not be enough, because the bank themselves should do a lot. During the involvement of the crisis, they should undertake activity to reduce losses. In this case, the banks should be requested to evaluate their own losses and the effects when a scenario is given to them. As a rule, that kind of exercise covers major banks. This exercise takes place every year, and the results are aggregated into the aggregate evaluation estimate, and they are used for the discussion with the banks to evaluate the vulnerability of the banks. Here are the results of the stress tests, including 4 macroeconomic transient, and including what will be the losses and how it will affect the banking sector capital adequacy. One understands that it's not a forecast, not a prediction. It is more what if analysis. If this particular scenario materialize, you just change one line, one transient, and that scenario would be different. Over here, the conclusion made that if this particular stress or crisis, more than 100 banks would face the deficiency of capital, and it will be the level of the percentages shown at the graph. And there is another area. It is macroprudential stress testing. I would like to thank the Financial Stability Department colleagues and Mr. Danilov for this slide that illustrate this particular concept. It was made public and it was discussed by the banking community. It provides for the vulnerability analysis not in the banking community or on the insurance, but the financial system in its entirety, and using complicated macroeconomical scenarios, taking into account the connections between different sectors, and also taking into account the second level parameters and the activity of the entities to support the financial system. This process is still ongoing, it is underway, and it is a burning issue not only in Russia but in the other countries. To illustrate, that's the picture to illustrate the discussion that will follow up by my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Alexei. I would like to give the floor to David Brown, because his contribution will also refer to macroprudential stress testing, which is a well-known practice for other regulators for not so long ago, but it is already there.
Very pleased with your last slide, because it demonstrates that sometimes inside the Bank of Russia, the prudential regulation people and the macro-prudential people actually do talk to each other. Sometimes it appears to us that you don't.
It's not mine. I pass on your gratitude to our.
But you at least know where their desk is. So. I'm sorry, that was a joke. No, my comment quietly just now was that actually Pillar 2 isn't the only place where stress testing has a prudential impact potentially, and my example was exactly that last slide, because we now live in a world, although we haven't yet seen the effects of it, we now live in a world where it's possible to change the multiplier on RWAs in response to potential macro threats. And actually a very good way to understand what macro threats look like is stress testing. And I suppose to the extent I wanted to make any specific point when we talked about stress testing today, it's actually the phrase itself is not very helpful, because we use stress testing inside Alpha Bank at the level of individual businesses. We use it at the level of the bank. I'd love to use it at the level of being able to understand what the stresses could be because of interconnections in the market, but I can't, because I don't occupy that viewpoint. Only, well, I guess in Russia, only the central bank and Sberbank know what's going on in the market as a whole. But I suppose my point is stress testing is extremely important and a very, very valuable tool for regulators and for risk managers. But we need to understand we each have different roles in that process, and that if we think that the right goal in stress testing is to have some uniformity across the market, I think that's wrong. There are certain circumstances in which we do need uniformity, but they're minimal. What's stressful for me might not be the same thing at all that's stressful for VTB, for Sberbank. So I should, when I'm conducting stress tests, when I'm building stress tests within Alpha Bank, I should be building those to be relevant to our business. Okay? When the central bank is building macro-prudential stress tests, they should build them to be relative to the market as a whole. Let me be very quick and finish by answering the two questions that you posed at the beginning. I agree with you that the idea that the only answer to stress testing is that you need to go and ask a bank to put up capital against this painful but low probability scenario is an impossible position to be in. What I would say is that before the financial crisis, your foreign regulator friends actually did have an answer to that, which is that they would debate the results of the stress tests with the bank, and they would accept a package of management actions and potentially capital or liquidity addition as being the answer to how the bank would manage its way through that stress. So the most important thing was the bank understood that it had that vulnerability and that it had a concept of how it would manage its way through it. After the financial crisis, the dialogue from the regulators, well, look, you told us a bunch of lies. You said you'd do all of these things, and you didn't do any of them. Well, the truth of it was the crisis was so severe that most banks couldn't do any of those things. We'll go and issue some new sub-debt. Well, I don't know if you remember, there wasn't a big market for bank sub-debt in 2008. If we want to manage, if we think that we can only deal with the world by assuming that the only crisis situation we're going to be in is one where management is not capable of taking any actions, okay, then probably we should just finish with fractional reserve banking as a whole. But that has consequences, very severe consequences. So I think the dialogue should be one that's more about the understanding of management of their vulnerabilities, and understanding that there's the existence of at least a superficially credible set of actions that management would take if they faced that difficulty. Very quickly, the answer to your other question about publishing the results of system-wide stress testing, if you take that step, please don't. I don't mean to say this in a way that anybody would be insulted by it, but publishing such information on the website of the Central Bank of Russia is likely to create a panic. And it will create a panic that exists because people don't understand what they're being shown. We need to work very hard on increasing financial capability in Russia before we start talking about publishing quite esoteric results on the central bank website.
Да, Дэвид, в общем-то, у нас не было желания.
Well, we had no desire to publish these stress test results. We are fully sensitized what a threat that is. But I just refer to it as one of the aspects of the discussion between us and regulators, because there is such a practice to publish the results of stress tests without indicating the name of a specific bank. So such discussions are there. We believe that publishing such information, although we are compelled to be transparent by the society, we cannot disclose our internal expertise. So, although we are urged quite often to disclose the stress test results and to disclose what we know about banks, well, we know a lot about banks, but this is not all of that information is publishable. Because, as you are well aware, this information can be misunderstood so as to fall out into premature destabilization of the banking system. We are short in time, therefore I would like to give the floor to representatives of two banks so as to speak about stress tests in supervision and your own stress test practices. Let's start with Bank first. Thank you so much. Well, stress tests are a useful tool because, well, providing a follow-up to our medical scenario, we know that there are no healthy patients. There are patients that have been underdiagnosed. Therefore, well, stress tests are a practical tool. So we follow everything that regulator is doing. Well, as it has already been said on the margins, a stress test within a large bank may impact the entire banking system. Well, I clearly see that there is a close link between microprudential and macroprudential dimensions. So this impact is deals with two aspects. Those are the bank business model, because stress tests transform the business model. If it is a system-based bank, a stress test of such a bank would influence the economy overall. And the second story is liquidity. So the bank business model and liquidity. So we do stress tests for both the first and the second aspects. We have a specific practice that allows us to simulate all sorts of drills within the stress testing framework. As for the business model, this is not something that we can subject to stress tests too often. However, we also do that on a routine basis. We have results on how stress tests transform the business model and the liquidity. However, the regulator is not presented with this information because today liquidity is beyond regular stress test practices and beyond the ICAP. Whereas, on the contrary, European regulators would look into liquidity as well and business models as well. Well, a couple of months ago, we have been tasked to develop liquidity stress tests as well. Well, once regulators are presented with information on liquidity and bank system stress tests, that would be highly informative for the regulator and in terms of macroprudential practices. Well, I would like now to give the floor to the representative of VTB Bank. What are your stress testing results, and do you publish the results of stress tests? In some countries, the banks are obliged to disclose stress tests results. Well, I would like to join into what David and Alexander have already said. Stress tests are a crucial tool for risk management. The scope of parameters that we look into within the framework of stress tests, including sensitivity, liquidity, scenario stress testing. Well, what we have overlooked is the measures that an entity would respond with once it's presented with results, and what's important is when to launch these measures. The sanitation procedure, if I'm being medical, includes planning. Once we build up our 3-year strategy, so just because there is no reason to have longer terms, well, this 3-year strategy includes specific forecasts in terms of the capital, in terms of the loan portfolio across different segments, client risks. Therefore, severely adverse and baseline scenarios are highly important in this respect. Within annual planning, we have to know amid what stage of the economic cycle we are. If it is your 8th year within the economic cycle, and the economy is on the rise, it's taking up. Therefore, amid a GDP growth, the stress test would yield 0 results. We also have reverse stress testing, provided that we know the exchange rate parameters, the GDP parameters, whether the bank follows the norms and the capital rate. As for disclosing stress test results, I join in with David and you, Mr. Posnashev, because in saying that We must not publish these results because this would incur losses and with a dramatic spillover on behalf of the public. So this is an issue for professionals. We have to be transparent in communicating with the regulator, but we should be also, however, we have to be careful about publishing stress test results in open sources. Well, we have almost run out of time, so just to make it more vibrant, I would like to address a question about stress testing to all the participants. So in your company, what's your understanding of stress tests? And what is the understanding of stress tests with regulators? So what is the risk stress factor that is the most crucial?
Time check. I think oil prices and what's the value? Our value was 25 and 20, and we will survive. For how long? It was not for how long they will survive, but for how long the oil price will be between 20 and 25. You promised it will be express a question for one question. But we counted for 3 years, and we would survive. But much depends on the Bank of Russia. Well, a year ago, I would give the same answer, but I think the latest developments and sanctions imposed against our banks are something that we should be thinking hard, and how could we describe those sanctions as a risk factor and what we should do about it. I would try to be brief, and 2002 we did the stress testing of the Russian bank community, and the people have come and they said, Mikhail, we need to do the checking. Like if the two borrowers will be bankrupt and the shares would drop by 30%, what would happen? And I told my management, well, I will have to do the work, and let me analyze, and let's tread carefully with the figures. And I asked, how come? What's that? And he said, stress testing is not a science, it is art. And I would like to say that nothing has changed in the past 17 years. Oil is one of the factors in our stress testing, but we realize that the parameters we are interested in, like GNP, exchange rate, and interest rates, are interrelated between one another. And so we could say GNP, but it is easier to deal with oil prices. And that's the scenario, the stringent scenario. We operated with $25 per barrel, and stress test is an art, and we will have to understand that the stress test results should show, and if there is the capital adequacy and the normative capital inadequacy, then the source of capital could be only profit. There is no any other source of capital now. And referring to what I said before, it's important to see how this business model is part of all the procedures, because to increase the capital, you will have to earn more. and it is important.
Answer than has been given by others if we want to look at stress testing formally. But I think that what Alexei Lubanov said is also very important. The problem is that the imposition of sanctions and the extent of those sanctions imposed and when those sanctions would be imposed is impossible to model. And therefore, we can only look at that effect by looking at concentration, because the lower our concentration risk, the less we can be affected by those sanctions. What would frighten me personally, and what I think we would all find very difficult to live with, at least in the short term, were if a large Russian bank, particularly if it happened to be Sberbank, but VTB would also be somewhat inconvenient, were to become an SDN. I think that would impose a very big shock on the market, and I'm not sure. We have built our own action plans for that, but I'm honestly not 100% convinced that in practice they would work, and we'll all be looking to you.
Спасибо большое. Ну, давайте поаплодируем участникам панели за их интеллект.
Let's applaud the panelists for their intellect, sincerity, and spirituality. Everything was given into play, and thanks for your participation. See you tomorrow.